This lecture is going to be about foreign policy and proxy wars that the Reagan administration engaged in, primarily in the Third World. During the majority of the 1970s, when détente was the American foreign policy du jour, and the defeat in Vietnam was still a fresh wound, momentum and appetite for hawkish war attitudes were at recent lows. But the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan changed the dynamic of American foreign policy. Not since the Stalin era had the USSR used military force to occupy a nation, and while containment had been the foundation of American foreign policy since the close of the Second World War, in the face of new Soviet aggression, the policy, to many Americans, seemed insufficient. Rollback, or the elimination of communism, seemed to be a more necessary approach. Much like the new conservatism which sowed its seeds in the 1960s, beginning with Barry Goldwater, but did not crystallize fully until the 1980s, the hawkish mantra of neoconservatives followed a similar trajectory. Only a little over a decade and a half prior to Reagan's presidency, Goldwater's promoting the use of low-grade nuclear weapons in the jungles of Vietnam was viewed as asinine, which it was, and justifiably ended any remote hopes he had of winning the presidency. But when in the early 1980s, the United States began arming murderous regimes in Latin America, it was viewed not as outlandish in the same way that Goldwater's comments were, but a necessary step towards protecting the United States from the perceived, ever-present threat of communist insurrection. While Al Haig, Reagan's Secretary of State, Dick Cheney, future VP for George W. Bush, and Donald Rumsfeld, Bush's Secretary of Defense, are some of the more high-profile neocons, as neoconservatives were known in shorthand, Reagan ambassador to the UN Jeane Kirkpatrick was perhaps the prototype of a Reaganite hawk. In a hypothesis that was eventually proven to be utter nonsense, but by the time it didn't matter, Kirkpatrick commented that anti-communist regimes, no matter how unsavory, were ultimately open to democratic reform, while revolutionary, read communist, regimes were utterly impervious to change. Looking at any one of the former Warsaw Pact nations in the late 1980s would clearly establish Kirkpatrick's thoughts as bogus, but the more impressive yet equally horrifying success of the neocons was to label anti-communist regimes that received aid as freedom fighters. In another example of coded language that endeared Reagan to a population while simultaneously having nefarious undertones, these group of freedom fighters included factions that murdered innocent civilians, including an American nun contingent, acquired most of its revenue through macro-scale drug trafficking, and walked through Afghan bazaars throwing acid in the faces of women who were dressed in an unacceptably clothed way, from a subjective perspective. But back to Kirkpatrick for a second. While the feminist movement had made some headway in the 1960s and 70s, despite conservative pushback, there was still a de facto bias in Washington regarding a female presence in government, and particularly in military-related politics. Kirkpatrick's ideas were not decisively more militaristic than other neocons, but were remarkably hawkish compared to most women. In a sense, in order for Kirkpatrick to even have a chance of establishing a place in the Reagan inner circle, she faced two challenges. One, appearing hawkish enough that she could not be labeled, albeit an utterly sexist critique, as militarily weak, and two, breaking into an office that had been dominated by men since its establishment. Kirkpatrick's uber-hawkishness gave Reagan an opportunity to embrace an increasingly militaristic approach, while also claiming to be a promoter of gender diversity. Long story short, Kirkpatrick's ideology, while perhaps dangerous, was a winner for both her own career and the president. A similar argument regarding the promotion of gender diversity would later be raised by conservatives when the president appointed Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court, even though Reagan tried to ram through uber-rightist Robert Bork shortly thereafter. Please take a minute to answer the following questions before continuing with the lecture. Up until the 1960s, the American Armed Forces resume had been flawless. Its highlights included victories over Mexico, Spain, the Central Powers, and the Axis powers. But Johnson's decision to amp up American military presence in Vietnam, that peaked at over 500,000 in 1968, and the ensuing American defeat following the withdrawal of forces in 1973, as well as the fall of Saigon to the NVA 2 years later, led many to question American military prowess. While there were many rational reasons why the American effort in Vietnam did not end in success, navigating through dense jungles and triple-digit heat with remarkably heavy equipment, the youthfulness and relative inexperience of American GIs, an inability to identify adversaries, and fighting two wars, a civil war in the South against the Viet Cong, and a conflict against the NVA simultaneously, that did not appease the "what have you done for me lately" crowd. Reagan, who believed Jimmy Carter's emphasis on human rights was an embarrassment, knew that there needed to be an ideological altering of the American psyche for his new conservatism to take root. Considering that even in the age of stagnation, direct military confrontation with the Soviet Union was implausible, Reagan knew he needed his own splendid little war to get Americans back to believing in the invincibility of the American military machine. In order to get Americans behind the concept of a revitalization of the military, Reagan knew the narrative of Vietnam needed to change. Even though the American withdrawal in Southeast Asia was not complete until the mid-70s, even before then there had been domestic dissent regarding the rationale behind and viability of the conflict. Ever since, thanks in part to Nixon's endorsement of détente, and Carter's focus on human rights, war had become viewed as a mistake, and diplomacy through military action had lost a sense of respectability. Since his defeat for the 1976 Republican presidential nomination, Reagan had made no secret of his intention to not just contain but roll back communism, and to make that happen, he needed to first eradicate the ghosts of Vietnam. When referring to the war in Vietnam, Reagan referred to it as a noble cause. While this caused initial uproar, more subtle suggestions of the very same premise gradually eroded American antagonism towards the crux of the Vietnam War, and subconsciously began to rewrite American remembrance of the very divisive era. The second step Reagan took to reinvigorate American war hawkishness involved the perpetuating of a myth that the American troops who fought in Vietnam returned home only to be objects of domestic insult and hatred. The reasoning behind this campaign was to suggest that a lack of domestic support, not faulty military planning and policy, contributed to the American defeat. While there was zero truth to this quote-unquote spat upon the veteran myth, a poll in 1971, the height of anti-Vietnam sentiment, found that 94% of troops described their stateside reception as friendly, while three-quarters disagreed with the statement that people at home who opposed the war often blame veterans for our involvement there. Reagan was able to begin a shift in their remembrance of Vietnam. But perhaps Reagan's most successful attempt to eliminate the ghosts of Vietnam was to fundamentally differentiate government from military, even though the entities are effectively the same. Through his libertarian views, Reagan had already laid the framework, but his consistent proclamations to Washington bureaucrats hamstringing American troops who were fighting for their lives was remarkably effective. Comments such as troops were asked to fight, quote-unquote, with one arm tied behind their backs by their own government became par for the course. Reagan's hatred of big government and love affair with the military also contributed to the equation of a new American ideology. The military is both awesome and a symbol of America. By questioning the military, in a sense, Americans would be acting in an unpatriotic way, which was culturally unacceptable. The fact that the Pentagon began to finance movies and television programs that featured Vietnam-hardened commanders, allowed to finally get the job done, so to speak, or veterans who returned to civilian life whose rogue behavior not only to save the day, but refused to allow an ultra-cautious government to tie their hands behind their backs, didn't hurt either. So even if the president's words didn't resonate with some Americans, or worse, were deciphered as bullshit, the seemingly harmless and often mindless stories of Hollywood did the job for him. Please take a minute to answer the following questions before continuing with the lecture. While the rise of Fidel Castro in the late 1950s, the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and 1962's Cuban Missile Crisis were causes of major American apprehension about the rise of communism in Latin America, the subsequent 2 decades brought very little cause for alarm. The overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile in the early 1970s was the only real quote-unquote threat the United States faced. But the rhetoric used by Reagan, painting the Soviet Union as a menace and land-hungry, re-established a paranoia that had been dormant. In El Salvador, alarmed at the revolutionary insurgency, neocons in the Reagan administration advocated strongly for the support of the Salvadorian military government. However, multiple horrid human rights violations tainted the El Salvadorian mission from becoming the success Reagan had hoped for. When 4 American nuns involved in a humanitarian mission were found murdered, likely at the hand of the American-backed Salvadorian junta, the official response out of Washington was that the nuns were undercover political activists, While it was never directly uttered, the message was that the nuns were deserving of their fate. Very little attention was paid to the fact that the story was utterly false. It was later proven that Salvadorian National Guardsmen were ordered to murder the nuns. Less than a year later, approximately 900 peasants were murdered at El Mozote, where, while there was little doubt internationally that the villainous action was a product of U.S.-sanctioned Salvadorian death squads, Reaganite Elliott Abrams provided false testimony to Congress in which he referred to the atrocities at El Mozote as not credible. Despite the violence, American assistance to hardline Salvadorian factions had prevented the rise of a socialist regime. It was hardly something the president could trumpet as an unquestionable victory. The fact that Archbishop Oscar Romero was assassinated during a mass and his assassin was never brought to justice further prevented the president from pointing to El Salvador as an emblem of order that could be established thanks to American engagement. In Nicaragua, action was apparently necessitated by the fact that revolutionary, read socialist, Sandinista forces had been providing the El Salvadorian insurgents, the side the U.S. was not supporting, with weapons. While shutting down the weapons supply line was important for success in El Salvador, the additional provision of nearly $20 million to arm and train the anti-Sandinista Contras was never disclosed to Congress. Technically, the 1973 War Powers Act, which mandated the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of any military operation, which would then start a 60-day clock to determine mission progress, was not being violated, but the secret funding and training to a group that had not been deemed worthy of congressional aid was a move reminiscent of Nixon's imperial presidency. The story of sketchiness via American aid to Nicaragua in the early 80s was far from over, and would eventually culminate in the Iran-Contra affair that nearly cost Reagan his presidency, but I'll save a more thorough explanation of that crisis for next week. Considering the quagmires that accompanied American efforts in El Salvador and Nicaragua, it wasn't until Grenada where Reagan found an opportunity to frame what was sure to be a short and successful mission as evidence that the ghosts of Vietnam had finally been eradicated. When in 1979 the Marxist government of Grenada began to develop ties with Castro and construct the foundation of what could become an airport, the United States began to worry about the possibility of a missile crisis 2.0. Complicating matters further, in 1983, the PRG, the People's Revolutionary Government of Grenada, was overthrown, resulting in the murder of the previous head of state, Maurice Bishop. Whereas direct American military action was deemed unnecessary when funding and training would suffice in El Salvador and Nicaragua, American troops were sent to Grenada in October of 1983. The rationale behind the operation was twofold. One, to prevent the establishment of a pro-Cuban, pro-Soviet regime close to American borders, and two, evacuate a few hundred American medical students enrolled at St. George's University. Ironically, humanitarianism had never before been a concern of the Reagan administration. For evidence, all one had to do was remember El Salvador, but was cited as a major reason for engagement in Grenada. Following the success of the mission, Reagan spoke of how American troops got to Grenada just in time. But perhaps more importantly, the president credited the success in the Caribbean as an example of the United States defeating a Soviet proxy government, and as a return to the invincible American military of years past. Please take a minute to answer the following questions before continuing with the lecture. A figure that had been in the news relatively recently, but first achieved international relevance in the late 1960s, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, much like the Sandinistas and the revolutionary regime in Grenada, concerned the Reagan administration quite a bit. Gaddafi's unique blend of pan-Arabism, Islam, socialism, and a pro-Palestine ideology was both perplexing and concerning. The United States' unwavering alliance with Israel stood at odds with Gaddafi's close bond with Yasser Arafat and the PLO. Pan-Arabism threatened to disrupt the balance of power in northern Africa and the Middle East, potentially making raw material markets increasingly volatile. And the socialism aspect of Gaddafi's policy was the most obvious lack of consistency with American attitudes. A brief confrontation in which Gaddafi fired on American naval forces, only to receive a subsequent demolition, was a prelude to state-sanctioned terrorism that would persist into the latter part of the 1980s. The bombing of a Berlin club, in which 3 casualties included 2 American soldiers and over 200 injured in 1986, reignited American-Libyan tensions and caused an American bombing of Tripoli and Benghazi, in which 15 were killed. Perhaps the most infamous act of Libyan sanctioned terror was the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, in which 270 people were killed. While these relatively minor dust-ups with Libya were far from the most high-profile military engagements of the 1980s, it did speak to a lack of clarity and defined purpose in American Middle Eastern policy, a trend that would be exposed in Lebanon as well as more recently in current military operations. Ever since Israel's establishment in the late 1940s, tensions in the Middle East had been high. The Six-Day War of 1967 and the Yom Kippur War of 1973 further added fuel to the fire. So while disappointing, it was hardly surprising that tensions between Israel, Lebanon, and Palestine boiled over into the early 80s. High-profile violence that included the murder of Lebanese president-elect and nearly 1,000 Palestinian refugees living in Syria led Reagan to commit nearly 2,000 Marines as part of a peacekeeping operation. But the lack of a clearly defined purpose led the American military presence to be targeted. In April of '83, an explosive-laden van drove into the American embassy in Beirut, killing 63. Later that same year, another attack on the Marines barracks at the Beirut airport in Lebanon killed 241. Lacking a coherent policy, Reagan withdrew the remaining military personnel. The only thing that stifled what could have been a serious political penalty was the Soviet Union shooting down of a Korean airliner, killing all 269 aboard. While the American mission in Lebanon may have lacked a clear mission, and resulted in tragic loss of life, the Soviet demolition of the Korean Airlines flight was both avoidable and belligerent. Please take a minute to answer the following questions before continuing with the lecture. While perhaps not as press-worthy as other American military efforts, due to a lack of American troops on the ground, one of the Reagan administration's most profound foreign policy successes involved the financing and supply of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. While it was during the Carter presidency, when American aid was first provided, it increased dramatically in both quantity and quality under Reagan. While Reagan was determined to eradicate the Vietnam Syndrome, he had no intention of sending American GIs thousands of miles away from home, in equally challenging, if dissimilar, terrain. Furthermore, in the age of mutually assured destruction, the potential for conflagration in Afghanistan went up dramatically if American and Soviet troops squared off head-to-head. But whereas the United States had been on its heels for the majority of Vietnam, due to challenges both unforeseen and impossible to change, America now found itself beneficiary of the uncontrollables in Afghanistan: terrain, an adversary that utilized unconventional warfare tactics, and a country that was impervious to centralization. Additionally, a comprehensive defeat of the Soviet Union was not necessary. In fact, a prolonging of the conflict in Central Asia, even in the case of an eventual defeat, would likely have been more advantageous than a quick victory. While American aid was meager at first, eventually, and thanks in large part to Texas Congressman Charlie Wilson, monetary aid to anti-Soviet factions in Afghanistan increased by the hundreds of millions. A particularly devastating weapon that was utilized against Soviet gunships included the Stinger anti-aircraft missile. Launched via a portable rocket launcher, it was virtually impossible for Soviet airships to detect Stinger presence before it was too late. Just over 9 years after the first Red Army tanks mobilized over the border, the last Soviet troops left Afghanistan. While short-term consequences of the war involved Carter's boycott of the Moscow Olympics, an embargo on grain shipments, the most significant effect of the war in Central Asia was the wave of Islamic nationalism that fundamentally restructured the southern frontier of the Soviet Empire, a process that would be formalized in the early 1990s, the establishment of nations such as Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, among others. Please take a minute to answer the following questions. Thanks for listening. Next week, we'll discuss the Iran-Contra affair, as well as the New World Order that was established following the Cold War's close. See you then.